Thank you so much. It's so exciting to be here. I have to say that I'm so excited to see so many Aardvark users around, and that I'm excited to be here mostly when I was asked, just because it's a chance to give back to sort of the startup community. I think the stories of startups, both successful or not successful, are really the ones that helped me, at least, having heard from the stories of Larry and Sergey, or many of the other entrepreneurs that you just rub elbows with in Silicon Valley, are really what give you a little bit of confidence that it is possible, even in all the doubt that you very likely will fail at doing a startup, that the stories of what happens along the way are the ones that are making it so worthwhile to actually spend so much of your time and energy on one thing. And I think what I wanted to talk about today, I'm going to probably repeat a few of the things from some of the talks my co-founders Damon and Max and Rob have given over quite a while. They were at Eric Race's talk, Startup Lessons Learned conference a few weeks back. How many of you were at that? Did you? So just a couple of hands. OK, so probably won't be repeating some of the stuff for some of you. But I think what was really interesting at Aardvark was a lot of our process and methodology about trying to reduce some of the risk that you take on as a startup. And so I'll be spending a lot of time talking about that, but also about how you do something hard, as Glenn just talked about, that when you're going to tackle a hard problem, algorithmically hard or just fundamentally challenging, how do you actually go about that with a process that can reduce the risk of dealing with some hard problems? But before I do that, I want to dive in depth on sort of that process and principles that helped us address that. I want to briefly shill our product. For those of you who've never used Aardvark, the premise is actually really simple, but I guess I'll start with a slide deck that we actually used with some of our VC pitches to describe sort of the space. Web search, as you all know and use, has been around for a long time. It's really good at sort of objective reference questions. What's Einstein's birthday is one of our sort of favorite examples of that, or how much is the cheapest iPhone? You can get pretty good data just from all the stuff that's been written down online. But when it comes to very sort of subjective and more personal questions, like a good dentist in Palo Alto, or what's a good book to read about political history, I've read Graham Greene's The Quiet American. Web search doesn't necessarily provide quite as good of results. It'll give you material, but you still have to then go through the work of sorting through which ones are relevant for you as a person and your own individual values and preferences. And so we looked at this, and what we saw was opportunity. We saw the coming of sort of social networks and the APIs to Facebook and your Google accounts as a sudden opportunity for taking advantage of sort of all of the personal networks that you've established in the world and all the information about you as a person that's coming online and being able to really find a way to personalize results for people. But we didn't exactly know how to do that when we first started. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But what we ended up with was this service that was basically a very simple contact that lived over email or instant messaging. And you could send it any question, and Aardvark would then go out and find someone from your social network to basically answer that question for you, send you back the result, and then you could chat back and forth with that person through Aardvark as an intermediary. And this was actually this pitch straight from vark.com, the website. But what goes on behind the scenes is actually much more complex, right? You have to be able to categorize a natural language question. You have to actually be able to index all of the information about people's profiles and their interests and try to extrapolate from a handful of things what they might know about in their heads. And those are actually really hard algorithms to build. It's what AI is good at, those sorts of problems. But if you were to set out from the start, if we had set out just to build those algorithms, blue sky problem space, we probably would have failed. And I say that because there's so many ways that an algorithm might not actually meet the product need, or it might not work in the way that people want it to work. And I guess what we actually did, though, was we took what was a familiar experience and improved upon it. And I want to talk about the process of how we did this, but this is the last slide about me talking about the product itself and how we improved on it. But most of you have had friends answer your questions. You may post questions in your Twitter status or your Facebook status and expect to get answers from people in your network. But it's pretty unreliable. You can't use it for a wide range of stuff, and you're limited by the number of people you know, the number of things you know about them, and then as they grow and develop and change and learn new things, you have to keep up with that to be able to really tap into that explicitly by sending them a question when you know that they know about MySQL. Not to mention that there's a big social cost of asking a favor. And so when we built Aardvark, these were some of the things that we saw as reasons we could improve upon this problem area. And if you think about why it mattered to us, one of the analogies that Damon likes to use and that I like as well is that this idea that the web search is really search over what humanity's managed to write down, whereas if you could have a service that really worked and could really reach into the minds of what everyone hasn't written down in the moment and get me a unique answer for my specific problem, that's special. And it's even more special by the psychology of it if there's a person on the other end that's actually listening to my problem in the moment. I feel a ton of gratification because they've listened to me and that their answer is explicitly targeted to me. And actually, one of the most interesting sort of use cases we saw in Aardvark was that they might get the same text back that was written down on a website. In other words, the person that answered their question would send them back essentially the same thing that was written on what they would have gotten had they searched for what they were looking for. But the fact that someone had listened to their question and written that answer back made them much more likely to actually go and do it, whether it was buying a book or staying at a particular hotel in Argentina. And I think that psychology of building products is really important. But yeah, so this was essentially Aardvark. And I think what was interesting is how we got there, especially given some of the things that have been said in the past two talks. I think you'll find a lot of similarities. What I think might be interesting is to think about how you can go about reducing that sort of risk of choosing a concept and then going about implementing it. Basically, our philosophy was minimize risk by maximizing trials. In terms of the conception phase, I think one of the analogies that Max uses, one of my co-founders, is that it's kind of like setting out to be an Olympic champion or to go to the Olympics. That if you were to go for that, you wouldn't just do the sport that you necessarily do as a hobby on the side, right? You would think about, like, what is the sport at which I'm going to have the most likely chance of succeeding at after I commit myself to years and years and years of pain and sacrifice and practice. And then you would try to choose that sport. Well, with a startup, it's even harder because there's almost an infinite number of ideas. I mean, Glenn rattled off all the things that he wishes were solved in the world that would make his life better. And I know that pretty much everyone in this room probably has their own list. I keep a Google Doc where I just throw in ideas as I have them, and then later, years later, sometimes I can go back through and actually it's interesting. 5 of them have been solved in the last few years, by some other startup. And that's not to say that I should have done that as a startup, but there's almost an infinite number of problem areas you could work on, and you want to pick one that is something you're going to be passionate about and that you can really solve with the team you have at hand, that is going to be a business that is going to be the type of business you want to run. Some startups are consulting firms that really solve problems in a different way than sort of the inflationary Silicon Valley model of throw, $10, $20 million, build a team, try to shoot for the moon, get a home run. There are a whole bunch of different styles and industries that you can focus on. And I think what we really did early on was we basically spent 6 months where we actually time-boxed ourselves and said, we're not going to write a line of code. We're not going to build our product. We're not going to even decide on what our product is going to be. All we're going to do is take the ideas that we have. we're going to try to, in a space, we had already determined that we kind of wanted to focus on this availability of people's social network data through APIs and try to make something useful that would really help them make decisions in the real world. So we had an area, and then we basically would prototype different ways we thought we could build products in that space. In some cases, it meant, actually having the time to have someone be on a phone and be able to take calls from people if we thought that it was going to be a phone-based product. In some of the other cases, it was actually just doing some very aggressive sort of user research testing, where we would build sort of cobbled together mock-ups of what a news recommendation service would look like, or a movie recommendation service. Give me your profile or a profile of a friend who's willing to do this, right? And then see how I as a human would even come about recommending movies to this person. And could that be compelling to them? And actually, a lot of them were not good ideas. They were really bad ideas. Some of them were actually really good ideas, and I think companies are building some of them out even now. They weren't our ideas, though. And one example of that would actually be, without going into the detail in specific, but in the mobile space. When we were doing this process, it was pre-iPhone, pre-Android. The mobile industry in the US was basically one that none of us wanted to touch with a 10-foot pole. And we kept coming up with these great ideas for all these things you could do in the mobile space to make people's lives better using these data sources and in this way, and basically kept throwing them out. And we finally asked ourselves, why do we keep throwing these out? And it was actually that we didn't want to work on them. And I think those are really important things to reflect on. So anyhow, to bring it full speed, Aardvark was actually one of these types of prototypes. We had a guy at a computer. I'll show you. This is actually what the early sort of experimental Aardvark looked like. It was one person at a computer with multiple chat clients open and a spreadsheet which had all of the results of all the people we'd sent invitation emails to. We essentially faked that it was from our team, but it looked like the service already existed. So we didn't send them an email saying, hey, I'm starting a company and this is going to be our prototype, and would you sign up? It was like, this is a product your friend Nathan trusts your opinions about MySQL, and if you want to join, just reply. People would reply, and we put them into this prototype spreadsheet and basically ran Aardvark. The operator would get the questions over chat and would paste them into the spreadsheet and then would send back answers after submitting out the question out to the people in the spreadsheet who he would study that spreadsheet of interests and say, oh, these people look like they might know about that. And then he'd send off the question to them and get answers back and then basically act as the human switchboard. So we had a lot of success with that. People really responded to that, and ultimately we decided we were going to try to implement that, take it to sort of the next level. And I think that's where sort of you can take some of those same principles of wanting to learn in a repetitive fashion. You want to keep, you want to basically go through a cycle where your implementation process isn't one where you're projecting what you think the product has to be. I mean, this is the trade-off Glenn was talking about. How do you make these choices about, is it my vision for what the product should be, or is it what a user actually says? And I think your voice matters there. It does matter that you have a feeling about the product, but go ahead and test that. Go sit down with real people and see what they say, hear what they say. And so we would do this every week. We would bring in 12 people. We would get them off of Craigslist. We would, some of them would be users, so we'd email out users after they sign up or when they'd been a user for months, and actually get them to come in and talk to us. And at first, in the implementation process, it would be as simple as showing them some of the things we were going to try. But it's also as simple as asking them where the faults are in the product. And then that can go through a design cycle and essentially go back in front of the users before you ever write a line of code. And this is all about reducing sort of risk for us, simply because the more cycles you get in front of users before you try to sit down and write Agile stories and actually figure out how you're going to implement it, the more likely you are that your feature is going to succeed, that people are actually going to want it. By default, the likelihood of sort of success with anything you're going to try as a startup is well under 50%. So, if you think of it as a coin flip with everything you're going to do, that's not a very high probability. So you've got to be ready to fail and iterate fast. But everything that you can do to sort of minimize the risk and get more trials through, the better. We'll come back to this in a second, but what I want to talk about is how we took Aardvark from sort of this very early prototype stage to an automated product that was an algorithmic-driven product. The typical Agile engineering process isn't necessarily going to get you there out of the box. And a lot of the credit for us getting there goes to my co-founder, Damon, who really spent a lot of his career studying AI, but also as a philosopher, which I think gives him a very unique perspective on how to apply AI algorithms to problems. So if you think of the very early phase of Aardvark, that prototype that I showed was basically full human judgment. And the most that was going on there was really logging of the interactions with users. That TechCrunch made this point that we essentially faked our product until we made it. And I would actually tweak that slightly and say we actually faked our product so that we could make it. A lot of AI algorithms, you can't really build them without data. You can't solvably try to do machine learning unless you've already gathered data of enough samples that you can then build an algorithm off of. And the real art to this sort of problem space is to be able to ratchet down the human involvement in a constrained way so that your algorithm isn't sort of having to be more than it really has to be. In other words, you can tweak the product design such that building the algorithm is actually easier. And so if you think about what we did in this process over the 9 months that happened, there was this middle phase where the humans were slightly constrained in what they could do to run the product. They couldn't just free-form inner text or edit the copied pasted text. It had to actually be constrained by the system into what they could do. Meanwhile, the system was getting slightly better at offering them suggestions, right, about the people who might know about the question that's being asked, which gives us feedback then on the algorithm and lets you develop it further. And then there's this switchover point that you get to where you could almost switch it over. They're basically rote tasks that are going on. And the system is basically offering up these very mechanical Turk-like situations. A or B, X, Y, or Z. Pick the top 5. And once you get to that phase, you're really close, and you can just almost switch it over seamlessly into automation. And I think it was one of the most novel things that we did in our process was getting to an automated process with a lot less risk than we would have had we not been running a product that entire time. Because during that phase, we were also improving the product experience. We were doing that whole design and iteration cycle in a very agile team fashion every week. We were interviewing people and doing a weekly learning cycle where we would talk about everything that our users had said about the product on Twitter, on Facebook, over email to us, all in one sort of consolidated learning session. And so in a way, you can almost think of this slide and this sort of trying to get the problem to an automatable place as even harder because we were improving the product as we went as well. So it wasn't just that these lines had to converge 9 months out. It was that they had to converge but also be a much better product 9 months out. So I guess I want to go back to something that Glenn actually talked about picking a hard enough problem. And I think he's right on. I think there's also the inverse, which is that you can pick too hard of a problem. I think if you're a research scientist at a lab where you're being paid to do research, or you're at a university where you're doing your PhD a la Larry and Sergey, you've got all the time in the world to come up with a rocket ship. And I think maybe in those cases it's great to pick a problem where it's going to take you 4 years to get to an automatable solution that you can algorithmically solve. But if you're actually setting out to do a startup, there's a sweet spot, right? For us, if this hadn't converged around 9 months, you're in a bind, right? You're running a non-automated product that then has tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of users, and you can't possibly scale the cost side of it. And that's where a lot of the credit goes to Damon, because he was able to look at these sort of problem areas and rightly kind of say, as we were going through concepts and prototyping them, that's achievable in the time span that we're going to have to set out to do this. Or that's just too hard, that's not really plausible. And I think we as a team generally were ruling out the ones that were too easy because we wanted to be able to, for various strategic reasons, have a startup that wasn't easily duplicatable, that others couldn't just simply copy the thing you were doing, or that just wasn't going to be valuable to people. So feel free to interrupt me along the way here if anyone wants to pause in on any of this. I'm going to try and move through so that we can all get to the break a little bit. But I think the team and process learnings that we got along the way were meaningful too. And I think you heard some of this from Mike and Scott, but we experimented as much with our process as with our product, which is to say that every sort of few months, and as the team grew in size, different parts of the company would break, different parts of our Agile engineering team environment where we were sitting around and all coming up with the stories of what we were going to work on. Those things might work with 5 engineers, but when you have 10, that's suddenly a big waste of a lot of people's time, and you have to find new ways to cut that. But in general, I think the assumption that you're going to be wrong, even with your process and your team, is a healthy one. As Damon says, if you assume you're wrong, you'll at least be right about that. So, and I think it's a healthy skepticism that helps entrepreneurs, but also that healthy optimism that you can fix it, which is to say that you want your velocity to be high. You don't need to worry about failing in the short iteration sense. It's okay to make mistakes along the way as long as you have a process by which you're going to quickly address them. And I think hiring people who are okay with that is really important. And to the other points made earlier, like letting people go who don't fit into that type of model. I think exploiting collective wisdom was a big thing that sort of made our success possible. Being able to task not just our team, but also our advisors, our investors, and our users in a way that we would be able to collect and learn from that was really important. It meant that users felt invested in what we were building, that they felt that we listened, especially if you can show them with a lot of transparency what's going on. It takes a team of A-level people who are going to really be opinionated about what they're building and passionate about what they're building, and makes them all feel like they have a voice in the process. And so having sort of a group culture where you're really going to share everything, where you're going to show everything, and you're going to give people a chance to comment on that and tell you when you're totally off base or you're not being clear enough about things is really important to set aside and easy to skip over when you're starting a company as a founder, because you have your own vision and your own perspective. But I think that was one of the most important things that we did as a group, was setting aside that time on different time scales for those discussions. We would do them every week over bagels and coffee. We'd all gather around on Fridays, but we'd also do them every cycle. And those cycles changed over the course of the company. I think when we started, we would try to do sort of 3-month cycles, and by the end, we were actually doing more 3 to 6 week cycles where we'd break out from some of these discussions and actually go and form little teams around some of the things we were going to tackle. But I think that really helped us. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it with that. There's a ton of other, this set of slides is going to be available. There's a ton of other talks that we've given and white papers we've written that I hope, if you're interested, you'll read and find useful. But yeah, that's the brief version of our story. If anyone has questions, I deliberately saved some time so that I could take them. So have at, I guess. Anyone?
What's it like going back to Google?
It's actually, we were talking earlier about this up front here because I think the other Mike asked me this question. It's been great in many ways. I think when I joined Google, I was at Google for about 5 years in my first stint there. I joined when Google was small, and Google had grown, I think about 20,000 people by the time I left to go start Aardvark. And I think when you have ever been at a company through that much change, it's not exactly what you signed up for anymore in the early days. And that's not a judgment thing. It's just different, right? Lots of things are different when a company's large versus when a company's small. And I think going back this time around, it's interesting to know that the psychology of that for me has sort of balanced itself out, because now I know what I'm going back to, that it is a big company. But it's been great. I have lots of friends there still, and all sorts of fantastic people. So, Emily?
So you started with 4 people?
Yes, I was actually going to mention that after Mike and.
He said start with 2.
Yeah.
And it was important to talk, and it sounds like you guys did a lot of discussion, which sounded like it was necessary. It was helpful.
I think that's right. I think when you have more than 2 co-founders, I think all the points that were made about the 2 hold true, which is that you get a lot of value out of being able to balance each other's ups and downs out. I think it's great to have more people to share the experience with. So that's one of the big positives. But I think, yeah, you do end up having to have a lot more collaborative environment. And it actually made it easier for our first sort of sets of hires in some sense, because we were already used to sort of working in a group environment, not just a pair. But I do think the more traditional sort of model of 2 is probably a little bit more likely to succeed. I mean, I think we were lucky in that we didn't really have any major personality clashes, and the 4 of us really did work together really well. So.
But did having to get your decision vetted by 3 other people, did it make you go slower?
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes up when people talk about the whole user-centered agile engineering cycle too, right? In the sense of, do these iterations slow you down? And I think that was what I was trying to mention, was that when I say that you're basically minimizing risk by maximizing trials, every time we would talk about it, we were having a trial, essentially, of the idea, of the feature, of the concept, whether it's our marketing slogan or how we were going to actually, pitch our product, to what website name we were going to have. Was it Aardvark or Vark or Vark.com? There was one point when I think 3 of our investors were on a panel in Silicon Valley, unbeknownst to each other, that they were all investors in us, and all three of them talked about us in their talks. And the first one referred to us as Aardvark at one point, and the second talked about us as the Mechanical Zoo, and like the third called us Vark. And then only at the end did they realize that they were all talking about the same company. And they, of course, all emailed us and were like, you have a marketing problem. And so, of course, this is when we locked ourselves as the 4 founders kind of in a room for a whole day. And yes, we could have brought in marketing consultants to help us out, but in this case, it was actually, we just needed to figure it all out. We needed to come to an answer ourselves. And that kind of collaborative discussion actually, collective wisdom, I think, does improve some of the outcomes you get. And I think what we tried to do was apply that so that it wasn't just our wisdom and our judgments, but the outputs of one of those cycles would then go in front of users, right? And we would actually see how they reacted to it. And the way we would do it, every time we would bring in these dozen users every week, maybe some weeks 6 of them would be already users, and 6 of them would be people just who had no affiliation with Aardvark, had never been exposed to it whatsoever. And so we'd get a good sample of sort of data from different types of people. But we'd always have Post-it notes all over these sort of user research rooms of all the things they'd said, and then kind of rearrange the Post-it notes to make sort of qualitative groupings of themes that we would see and tease out. And we'd always have photos of them just to make them real people, too. Which I think, because when you go back and you look over the notes, you don't, it sounds silly, but in some sense, it's actually pretty important to make it real. So, yeah. Any others? I think we're out of time, so we should probably get going. But there was one other back in the corner.
Yeah, just real quick. What would you say would be the 2 to 3 things that would give you the confidence or made you feel like you had the right founding team?
Well, I think it depends on what problem area you're going to tackle, I guess would be my answer, if you're talking hypothetically. For Aardvark in particular, I think it was that we were all social people. And I think if you're going to build a social product, you don't want to have sort of an insular group of people who don't like talking to real people. So I think qualitatively, that would be one of the things. I think having Damon's very experienced sort of practice of dealing with AI algorithms gave us a lot of resources to be able to say we were confident that we could tackle a sufficiently difficult problem that would require a lot of that. Had we been working in the enterprise space, I think you would have wanted someone who had deep, rich enterprise contacts and experience sort of with sales. So that's a quick answer, I guess. Cool. Thanks. Appreciate your time.